cross stitchers, it's time to talk about knots. Not the bad unwanted kind when your thread gets in a twist, but the intentional kind that are part of the design. So we're talking French knots. Although I suspect that some of you might also call those knots bad and unwanted too. These can be tricky to get the hang of, and there are a lot of cross stitchers out there who simply prefer not to do them. I'm really hoping that won't be you after I show you how to do them and share my best tips for getting neat knots. I usually make my knots as French knots, but I'll also be showing you an alternative which some stitchers prefer, and that's the Colonial knot. I'll show you how to do each type of knot, we'll look at the differences between them, and I'll share 8 tips for getting neater knots. I'm also going to chat about why you may or may not want to substitute beads instead of knots. Hi there stitchy friends, I'm Kat from Catkin and Lily, bringing you all the best tips, tricks and tutorials so you can learn more about all things stitchy, grow your stitching skills and get the most joy from your stitching. Now, confession time, I actually enjoy French knots. Are mine perfect? No. But I have learned how to do them as well as I feel happy with, and also to embrace any slight unevenness with them. This video is going to be pretty packed with information, so please do make use of the chapter markers if you want to find or watch a specific section. As always, let's start with the basics. What are French and Colonial knots? Both types of knot are made by wrapping the thread around the needle before pushing the needle back through the fabric, so that you form a little rounded knot that sits on top of the fabric or your stitches. They are great for adding tiny details to designs such as the eyes on the colourful sheep, the cute polka dot accents on the stocking and the spots on the otter's face, and as a little highlight on the bubble. Here's what they look like on a cross-stitch chart. They're usually shown as a small dot, or in some cases, like on my patterns, a small knot motif. The knots may be placed on blank fabric directly over a hole in the fabric, so that's where the grid lines cross on the chart. But they can also be placed halfway along the edge of a square or even in the middle of a square. And of course, they can also be placed on top of completed cross stitches. So one more thing before I show you how to do French and Colonial knots, and that's about using beads as an alternative. If you're not keen on using French or Colonial knots, then a common suggestion is to replace them with seed beads. These will still add dimension to your stitching and can even add a little sparkle or shine too. If you find your French or Colonial knots look a bit variable, then beads can be really appealing because of their consistency. They will all look the same. That said, some beads do vary a little in size and shape too. The big downside to using beads is that in many cases they're simply too big and look out of proportion with the rest of the stitching. French knots are usually intended to be quite delicate, and I almost never want to create a knot that's as big as a bead. A very common seed bead size, such as the Mill Hill seed beads in their standard range, are 11/0. And then you have these smaller petite beads which are size 15/0. So other than some rare antique beads that may be smaller, 15/0 is the smallest size available. So that's these petite beads. And you can see the sizes here of the regular seed beads and the petite seed beads. So obviously if you are using beads, it's really important to try and choose a size that will work best with your design. So I've got a few designs here that use French knots, and you'll see what I mean about the sizing. So for this ice cream, these spots here are quite large and they could be replaced quite easily with a seed bead. You might even get away with a petite seed bead for the snail's eyes, the little dots in his eyes here, and possibly for the sheep, although I think maybe using seed beads for the eyes here could be a little bit out of proportion. And then I think very much for the otter, for these little spots on his face, I think if you use seed beads here, it would look a little bit out of proportion. Now all of these designs are actually stitched on 16 count Aida. So you may find petite seed beads a little bit better and more in proportion if you used 14 or 28 count fabric. But if you used 18 or 36 count fabric, then it's going to be even more out of proportion. In my opinion, and remember this is just my opinion, Using seed beads for any of these, perhaps bar the ice cream, just wouldn't look quite as good as French knots. So I've also brought these designs to share as a direct side-by-side comparison. So the eye and the little antennae dots on this bee have been done with French knots, and the ones on this bee, I've used seed beads. Now the seed beads aren't actually too out of proportion on here, but they do stick up a bit more, and I still feel that the French knots just look a little bit better. My personal view is that most of the time, even slightly wonky knots will look better than seed beads. And of course, I hope that by the end of this video, you'll be feeling more confident with them and won't even think of using beads. Okay, it's time to get into making some knots. You can make French knots with exactly the same needle that you use to complete the cross stitches, but there are other options which may help. So I'll talk about these in the tips section of this video. The pattern may indicate how many strands of thread to use, but you can also adjust this yourself. And for this demo, I'm going to be using 2 strands of thread. The size of the knot will depend on both the number of strands you use and also how many times you wrap the thread around the needle. I'll come back to that later and show you some different combinations of these so you can see what I mean. But first, let's walk through how to do a French knot step by step. So the first step is to ensure that your thread's secured. And you can do that by running through the back of a few stitches close by to where your French knot is going to be. Now, even if you're using 2 strands like this, I wouldn't recommend doing a loop start, as it can get a little weird to loop start and jump straight into a French knot. So instead, I'm going to secure by running through the back of a few stitches. And I do want to make sure this is extra secure because you're going to put a little pressure on the thread when you make that French knot. So there's a little bit more risk that the thread will pull out. So I'm actually going to go back and forth one way and then the other. That will keep it just a little bit more secure when I start to make my French knot. Okay, so first step for our French knot, we're going to bring the needle up from the back of the fabric. Now, I will say, of course, I'm demonstrating this holding this piece of fabric in hand. You may well find it easier, especially for the next bit I'm going to show you, if you have your fabric in a hoop or frame. Because I'm going to put my bit of fabric down at this point. And then I want to hold my needle parallel to the fabric, and I'm going to wrap my thread around the needle. So for now, I'm going to wrap once, twice. Now, if you're wondering whether it matters which way you wrap the thread, then hold that thought, because I'll come back to that later. For now, let's just get this French knot made. So I'm going to keep these wraps made with the needle fairly close to the fabric. I'm going to put my finger on the needle there, holding those wraps in place, so that when I then push my needle back down through the fabric, those wraps are staying where I've put them. Now, this is the next important part, because you want to go back down through the fabric, not exactly in the hole that you came up in, but just a little distance away. If you go directly back down the hole you came up in, sometimes when you pull the knot tight at the end, poof, your knot is gone because it will slip right through to the back of your fabric. This actually doesn't happen as much as you would think unless the knot is a lot smaller than the holes of your fabric. But it's best to be safe. So you want to go down a tiny fraction away from where you came up. And you can actually go slightly above, either side, or slightly below. So I'm going to go just to the left of where I came up. And then I'm going to take this loose end of thread and pull it tight. So I'm going to have my needle now fairly upright in the fabric. Hold that, tug that little thread there so that those wraps are nice and snug around the needle. And you can see I've got my thumb on here just holding that all in place. And that means I can now actually just keep that exactly where it is as I pull the thread through to complete the French knot. Now there are a couple of other ways that you can keep that tension in the knot. I'll show you, you can, as you come up, wrap round twice. Let's go back down slightly below this time. Pull that tight, like so. Now you can, if you want, you can even, as you pull this through, put your thumb right on top of that knot, but you can even hold it away as you pull that through, and it will still be absolutely fine. And you can see the difference that the positioning of my gap has made here, because this one was slightly to the side, so it's pulled the knot very slightly over that way, and here I left my gap to the bottom, so it's pulled it down just a tiny little bit. So it's worth bearing that in mind when you're deciding exactly where you want your finished knot to sit. So that's on blank fabric. I'll make a knot over here on the stitches so that you can see exactly the same process. Bring the needle up, wrap once, twice, obviously unless you want to use a different number of wraps. And then you're going to go back down. Now it can be a little more challenging on top of stitches to see exactly if you've left a little gap when you go back down. But it also matters a little bit less because the knot is far less likely to pull through to the back when it's sat on top of stitching. So let's try and go a little bit below. Again, I'm going to pull this tight as I'm using my, and I'm sort of using my thumbnail here to push that needle upright and keep it in place. And on the back, I'm just holding it with my fingers. In fact, I sometimes have both fingers on the back like this, again, holding that needle in place. So that's nicely held. And then pull that all the way through. And there's your French knot on top of the fabric. Now occasionally knots made on top of stitching can look a little bit smaller if they sink into the stitches a little bit. So not really a problem, just something to be aware of. So I said I would just show you the same thing in anger on the bee here as well. And this time I've got one strand and I want to make quite small delicate knots. So I'm going to use one strand. It's already in place for his eye, and I'm still going to go around twice. But that should give me quite a delicate little knot for his eye. Again, just going to pull that tight, take that through, and there's his eye. I'll do the antennae exactly the same. I'm just taking my thread across the back here. I wouldn't just take my thread across the back like this if I was doing this for real, but just to show you. Now for this one, because this is even weave, I'm going to go one whole thread across here. It's actually a little bit easier because you've got that one thread that you can go across. And there's one antennae. So I'm coming up in this hole here. I'll try and show you. Coming up in this hole. And when I go down, I'm going to go back down in this one. So I realise it's a little bit harder to see. So this hole here is where I'm going to go back down. So wrap once, twice, back down in that hole, pull it tight-ish. Again, not too tight. It really doesn't have to be too tight. And there's our completed bee. Let's talk about changing the knot size. And we'll take a look at what happens when you change the number of strands or the number of wraps around the needle that you use. This top row of knots are using one strand and increasing the number of wraps from a teeny little knot with one wrap, which barely looks like a knot to be honest, up through 2 wraps, then 3 wraps, and then 4 wraps. You can see how they get bigger and bigger as you'd expect until this last one. The reason it doesn't appear bigger is that adding more wraps stacks vertically up the needle. So this last knot is really just taller and not bigger in diameter. This second row is knots made with 2 strands, and I've done 1 wrap, 2 wraps and 3 wraps. And again, they get bigger. But again, the size increase is more vertical than sideways when you get to 3 wraps. When I make French knots, if I want small ones, I tend to use 1 strand of thread wrapped twice around my needle, or 2 strands of thread wrapped once around my needle, which gives basically the same effect. If I want a slightly bigger knot, then 2 strands with 2 wraps is great for that. I don't often like to do 3 wraps, so if I wanted a bigger knot, then I would be more likely to use 3 or even 4 strands, as I find that gives me a bit of a neater finish. That's what I've done here with 3 strands and 1 or 2 wraps, and then 4 strands with 1 or 2 wraps. However, it gets more difficult to pull your needle through the wraps the more strands you have. 3 strands was a struggle, and with 4 strands I almost gave up. I do have a tip later that can help with this though. The bottom line on how many strands and wraps I use all depends on how I'm feeling on the day and what I think will look best for the specific pattern. I also might choose the number of strands based on whether there's any backstitch in the same colour, especially if I can complete the backstitch and the knots at the same time. This is why in the demo you just saw, I used 1 strand, because the backstitch was also in 1 strand in the same colour. And therefore it was so much easier to also use 1 strand for the French knots, so I could complete them at the same time as the backstitch. Okay, so that's French knots, but what about these colonial knots that I mentioned earlier? Cross-stitch patterns almost always describe knots as French knots, but you can absolutely substitute these with colonial knots anytime you wish. So why might you want to do this? Well, some stitchers find them easier to make, and or prefer the look of them. They do look almost identical, as you can see from these pictures. The French knot is slightly flatter on top, and also flatter against the fabric, whilst the colonial knot has a slightly more domed top and stands a bit taller on the fabric. But the difference is so minor that I think you'll just have to try them out and see for yourself. I'll show you how to make one, and then I'll talk more about why some cross-stitchers prefer them and dive a bit more into those differences. Making a colonial knot is really exactly the same as making a French knot, with just a tiny difference in how you wrap the thread around the needle. So we're going to start in exactly the same way, with your thread coming up from the back of the fabric. And here's the difference. You want to start by making an upside down U, or what I tend to call a bridge with the thread, and place your needle under the bridge. Then you're going to take your thread and wrap it over the top of the needle. So you're forming, you can see there, a figure 8 shape. Again, we're going to pull those wraps tight, pop my finger on to hold the wraps in place, and go down with that tiny little gap. So all of this is now exactly the same as for a French knot. Tug that so it's snug and pull the thread all the way through. So we'll do another one over here. So it's making that the little bridge shape, needle underneath, wrap over the top, keep those wraps in place. I'll go below again on this one. Pull that tight, like so. Again, I've got my needle between my fingers on the back here and between the thumbs. So that's keeping that needle in place while I can do the tugging there to get that nicely situated. And then pulling through smoothly and gently. This bit is exactly the same for French knots and colonial knots. You want to pull the thread tight enough that you're not going to leave your knot all loose and floppy, but not too tight so that your knot ends up looking a bit strangled. So there's our 2 colonial knots, and we'll make another one on the fabric over here as well. So again, and some people find that this motion of going under the bridge and over like this is just a bit more natural than wrapping round. but it's really exactly the same. Again, you can hold your thread right up there if you like, or you can hold it further away and just pull that through. So there's your colonial knots. Now at this point, I think you'll agree they look pretty similar between the French knots up here and the colonial knots here. The only time you might see the difference is if I turn this sideways so that you can see the knots against my finger, and you can see how the colonial knot is just sitting up a little bit more than the French knot. I mean, that one's actually sitting up. You see, this is where I think my French knots look much tidier than my colonial knots, but some people find completely the opposite. If I find these ones, they look quite similar on there, but again, this is maybe just sitting up a little bit prouder. So to go back to our comparison, we can add a little more to that now. Some cross stitches like that slightly more raised finish, as it can make them more prominent looking. And some stitches find that they get a neater looking knot. I personally think my French knots look neater, but that's why it's a good idea to try both techniques. Other than that, I have seen a lot of conflicting information about how they look different. I've seen colonial knots described as more compact looking, but also fuller looking, which is somewhat contradictory. Some sources say that they're sturdier and more stable than French knots because of the figure 8 twist. And I'm not sure how true this is or how much it matters in reality. You may also read or hear that colonial knots are larger, but that's only partially true because, as you've seen, you can control the size of a French knot based on the number of strands and the wraps that you use. However, you do have slightly less control over changing the size of a colonial knot because of the way the thread wraps around the needle in a figure 8 shape. You essentially get 2 wraps every time. And you can't change that to 1 or 3. You can, of course, still change the number of strands that you use to vary the size of the finished knot. One other thing I've seen to adjust the size of a colonial knot is to add extra wraps of thread around the needle after making the figure 8. I don't know if that still counts as a colonial knot, but it would change the size, so I guess it is an option. But going back to how we looked at making colonial knots, here's a picture showing the sizes of colonial knots for increasing the number of strands. I've included French knots for comparison with both 1 and 2 wraps of thread around the needle. You'll see that the colonial knots are most similar in size to French knots made with 2 wraps. One thing I've read in multiple places is that colonial knots are easier to unpick and remove. If you put a knot in the wrong place or don't like how it looks, then removing it is a bit of a nuisance. You pretty much have to cut it out. But I tried unpicking both types of knots, and in both cases, I was left with a tiny knot in the thread. So despite these statements about colonial knots being easier to remove, my experience doesn't support this, and I can't find anything to show how this would be done. So if you do know how to remove a colonial knot without leaving a tiny knot in the thread, perhaps I'm just doing it wrong, then please do let me know. If you do need to remove a knot of either sort, you can pull the knot upwards and it will somewhat unravel, but it'll leave a tiny little knot, which you can then cut off. And then you have tiny little ends to run into the back and deal with. Now, I do have another video with a tip to help you do this, so I'll link that in a card and also in the description. Now you know how to make French and colonial knots, let's dive into my top tips to help you get the neatest finish. They are all great tips, but I'm going to start with the one that was a bit of a revelation for me and only fairly recently. So number 1 is which way to wrap. Okay, this is the bit I said I would come back to, and that's to experiment with the direction that you wrap your threads around the needle. I've often said that it doesn't matter which way you wrap the thread, so to do whichever feels more natural to you. Except maybe it does matter. I was experimenting and found that the way I naturally wrap my thread does not give me the neatest result. I used to wrap my thread over the needle to start with, but I found that wrapping under the needle gives me a neater knot. This does also very slightly vary how many wraps you have around the needle. So try it both ways and see which you prefer. Tip number 2 is do them last. I always leave any French knots until after I've completed all the regular cross stitches and potentially until after the back stitch as well, unless I want to complete the back stitch and the French knots at the same time. As you saw earlier with the bee design, I left the back stitch on the bee itself right to the end, so I could complete the French knots pretty much last. If you need to work knots on top of cross stitches, then this is a bit of a no-brainer. But my other reason for leaving them to the end is to reduce the chance of them getting knocked or squashed while you're completing other stitching. Tip number 3 is change your needle. If you're struggling to push the needle into the exact spot you want it to go, especially when leaving that little gap to go back down through the fabric, or if you're finding it difficult to pull the needle back through the wraps of thread, then you can try dropping down a needle size or using a needle with a sharp tip. For the bee design, I was using a size 26 needle on 32 count even weave, but I could have dropped down to a size 28 needle just to do the French knots, although this can also be helpful for backstitch. A smaller needle will be slightly narrower, making it easier to push through the fabric and the stitches, and also to pull through those thread wraps. Now, there are very few occasions that you want a sharp needle for cross stitch, but this is one of those occasions where they can be handy. The needle you're looking for is actually called a sharp, and as the name suggests, it has a very sharp pointy tip, which can help with piercing through fabric or threads, if you need to do that to place the knot as per the chart. The second reason they can be helpful is that the eye on sharp needles is narrower, so when it comes to tugging the needle and thread through the wraps of thread, it's much easier. You may also come across milliner needles, which are very similar but tend to be longer than sharps, and also chenille needles, which have the sharp tip but not the narrower eye. Tip number 4 is Goldilocks length. Don't try making French knots with a very short piece of thread, as it gets horribly fiddly. But you also don't want a crazy long thread, as that gives you loads to pull through each time, and all that time you have to try and maintain that nice even tension. I like to use about 50 centimetres of working thread, and I also know that I'm going to have to stop well before reaching the end of the thread and just waste that last little bit. It's far better to do this than trying to use the last bit, because I know I won't be able to get the needle positioned how I want, and the knot will end up looking messy. Tip number 5 is untwist. As with any stitching, and no matter how many strands of thread you're using, your thread can get twisted. So remember to untwist it regularly, because a twisted thread will not make for the neatest knots. Tip number 6 is test it out. I've talked about how the number of strands used and the number of wraps you make affects the size and look of your knots. So it's worth testing this out to see what you think will work for each project. You might prefer a different look than the pattern suggests, or it may not even make any recommendations, so you'll need to decide what you want to do. I very often just make a couple of test knots in the corner of the fabric first to get an idea of the size I want, so I don't have to be unpicking and cutting out knots on my actual stitching. Tip number 7 is tension practice. You want it tight, but not too tight. I think this might be the trickiest aspect of making knots, but it just takes a bit of practice to get it right. So if you need to, just make a ton of knots on a scrap of fabric, because it will get so much easier the more you do, and your hands will learn the best way to get the amount of tension that's just right. You can definitely pull a little bit more firmly when pulling the thread wraps tight around the needle, and while your needle's still in the middle of the knot. But then just keep that the same as you pull the needle through. Don't let that tension go, but don't pull any harder. And that leads me nicely to my final tip. Tip number 8 is don't be too hard on yourself and your knots. It's absolutely okay if your knots don't all look super neat or even the same each time, as this often adds to the charm of your project. I do hope that's given you more confidence to tackle French knots or to try out the Colonial knot. I always go for a French knot because it just comes much more easily to me, as it's the one I've done the most. And I like that I can get lots of size variation really easily by changing the number of strands and the number of wraps. But I definitely recommend trying out both methods to see which you prefer the look of, or which you find easier to do. Let me know if it's something that you've been worried about and if this video has been helpful for you. If you enjoyed this video, it would be awesome if you could give it a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss a single stitch. And it will also help my tips and tutorials reach and help more cross stitchers. If you're looking for more support from me and a fabulous community of stitchy friends, then I'd love for you to join my Patreon membership. You can find advice and inspiration and enjoy extra stitchy chat videos and regular live Q&As. Thank you so much for watching. Happy stitching and bye for now.